Welcome to the Mind Money Spectrum podcast, where your hosts, Aaron Agti and Trishul Patel, go beyond traditional finance questions to help you explore how to use your money to achieve the freedom you want in life.
In this episode, Aaron and Trishul explore the FIRE movement, financial independence, retire early. We discuss lean FIRE and fat FIRE and go back and forth on how important savings rates are for achieving future financial goals. We discuss how managing expenses is vital to accomplishing such savings rates. And finally, we discuss the idea that naming a movement may simply be an effective way to implement a variety of sound financial planning principles. And now, on to our conversation.
Hi, I'm Aaron Agti. I'm a financial advisor from the Bay Area. I'm having a conversation with Trishul Patel from the East Coast. And today we're going to be talking about FIRE, the Financial Independence Retire Early movement. I hope that you can find this conversation valuable. I hope that Trishul and I disagree just the right amount. And by the end, I hope that you'll have an idea of whether this might apply to you, or at the very least, what you could learn from this. Trishul, do you think there's any other thing that you want to add to how this conversation is going to go?
No, that's a great introduction, Aaron. Looking forward to the conversation.
Great. So when I've written and read about the FIRE movement, it's usually from the perspective of an individual or couple. They make pretty good money, they tend to be younger, and they are able to keep their expenses really, really low. And you get this super aggressive, almost hyper aggressive savings rate where they might be making over $100,000 each. So their household income's between $200,000 and $400,000 a year, and they're trying to save 50 to 70% of their take-home pay, or 57% of their income after taxes. And by keeping their expenses extremely low and saving so aggressively, they can get to this financial independence early, where when you look at safe withdrawal rate research and how much you would need to have saved to provide for a lifestyle, you see numbers about looking at the 4% safe withdrawal rate. So the idea is that if they can keep their expenses down around $20,000 to $40,000 per year, then they only need, doing math on my calculator, about $500,000 to $1 million saved up. So if they're able to save $100,000 per year, and they only need $500,000 to $1 million to be independent, then they can get there on the scale of 5 to 10 years. So you might have a couple starting in their early 20s, or maybe say 25, that are trying to get to be financially independent by the time they're 35. They might have someone on the scale of $500,000 to $1 million saved up, and that's enough to provide for their lifestyle. So, Trishul, how would you describe the FIRE movement, and then take us the next step of kind of thoughts on both implementation or how that affects lifestyle?
Sure. So, Aaron, that was a great introduction to the high-level notion. Basically, it boils down to the more you save, the more quickly you can retire, plain and simple. And if you think about it, there's a lot of gray around that, meaning some people, they want to retire and be very lean when they retire, and some people want to live a life of luxury when they retire. And some people don't mind working all the way until they're 70, and some people want to jump out of the rat race as soon as they possibly can. So people lie on the spectrum, and I'd say this type of movement probably resonates a lot more to people who want to be on the left side of that distribution. Basically, people who are comfortable with saving aggressively and cutting down on some lifestyle perks early on for the promise of being financially independent sooner rather than later. But as with any type of philosophy, there's a spectrum. And even with fire, there's also a spectrum. For example, there's this notion of lean fire. The notion of lean fire is just do whatever it takes to save absolutely as much as possible to get out of the race as quickly as possible. And then on the other side of the spectrum is this notion of fat fire. The notion here is that maybe you can save more. Maybe you want to save a lot more so you can not survive on 20, 30, 40,000, but maybe 70, 80,000 and live very comfortably. And you may have to work longer, but still the notion is you're trying to retire sooner rather than later. What I've noticed is that there are some people who want more independence in the way they go about their lives. And they can do that by having a safety net of a big cushion in place. And that big cushion is their notion that maybe they don't need to work until they're 60 or 70. Maybe they don't need to save a little, as is common. For example, the average family only saves a few percent a year over the course of their working career. And what that amounts to is the average American ends up having to work well past retirement age to have that retirement where they feel they're comfortable. And maybe there's an alternative to that status quo. And that's what FIRE is all about.
Okay, so I think there's a few things that I want to get to. So this is the first time I'd ever heard of fat fire. Everything I'd read about fire was the lean fire side of it. And so I agree with the idea of the savings rate matters. I kind of understand what you're saying about how just the savings rate in the US is way too low, and achieving financial independence before you're 60 is going to require savings rates greater than probably 10%. And we'll get into kind of some of those numbers. I like your idea of the spectrum. So I like this idea that there are some that are pursuing it overly aggressively, and there's some that are just, it doesn't even sound like it's a fire movement. It's just saving appropriately. It's not under saving, which would be the norm, unfortunately. It's just saving the right amount for their future goals. The next thing I like to kind of explore is that idea of that cushion and kind of how that can be freeing. I have heard others talk about the idea of having FU money, where once they get enough that they don't have to listen to anyone else, they can kind of design the lifestyle they want. And I think there's a little to explore there. But the last thing that I wanted to get to, and it's kind of my counter, tends to be, I guess this is more of a counter against lean fire, if I was trying to be more technical, but the idea of lifestyle and or having children. Part of the reason I say I can't, with the lean fire, to get expenses that low, it implies that they have to keep their cost of living extremely low, and so you have to keep their housing really low. I have read stories of people trying to live with their parents as long as possible to get to that point, or staying with the studio or one-bedroom apartment as long as possible. But any parents I know who have children, they are, and especially if they can afford it. So that's kind of the underlying assumption. These are couples who are both making over $100,000 a year, so they can afford to rent a 2-bedroom apartment or buy a house if that's a goal of theirs. They're choosing not to. But those that I see with kids, they kind of want to make sure they have enough space for those kids, that they want to have that bedroom, and they aren't choosing to live with parents or their kids' grandparents to pursue that. But I think more importantly, my biggest issue is those that I see pursuing fire, and maybe this is those super hyper aggressive lean fire, but they're looking to get out of the rat race. And I think that was the key phrase that you mentioned, is they're looking to get out of the rat race. And I think that implies that there's a lifestyle issue somewhere that could be solved without needing to be financially independent. It could be that they could find a different job that is a little more fulfilling. It could be that they could shorten their commute. I feel like there's whatever the reason they want to get out of the rat race, I think that there's a way to achieve that, or at least to solve that problem without needing to aggressively pursue financial independence. And so when I talk to clients, it's helping them understand there's a difference between the freedom you feel from having that FU money and the freedom you feel from knowing you're on track. That knowing you're saving enough to get to that financial independence in your late 50s, early 60s, I feel like that tends to solve a lot of the problems that those pursuing the lean fire have, that they think getting out of the rat race completely is the solution. I feel like lean fire is most likely not the solution to whatever their problems are.
I think that might be true for most people. What it really comes down to, again, is preference. A lot of people are not comfortable, driving around a used car for longer than they would like to, or they're not comfortable living in their parents' place a few years more than is perhaps customary. And they're not comfortable not eating at the best restaurants or taking the nicest trips. But there could be a demographic out there that is comfortable with those life choices, given the trade-offs that might be involved. Let's put an example to that to clarify things a little bit. Something that comes up a lot is you graduate, you're getting a good income. Like you said, you're earning $100,000, $200,000 a year, and you have your car. It's okay, but it's 5, maybe 10 years old, and you think, well, why not? Why can't I go out and get a new car? Rates are low. I can cover the monthly payment in my sleep. How much is that car really gonna push me back from my retirement? Let's kind of just think through a simple scenario and see how that might impact somebody down the road. Well, if you think about it, what the trade-off is let's say you've spent $20,000-$30,000 on a new car, and you trade your old car in for maybe half that amount, so you end up putting $10,000 into a car. You got a brand new car, and what does that really mean? So you think about what the opportunity cost that just happened right there. That same $10,000, you're in your 20s, could have grown over the next 40 years. Rather, it's sitting in a asset that's depreciating to almost nothing. Of course, you get the benefit of a newer vehicle, but you already had one. So, just run those numbers forward a little bit using just simple back of the envelope math. Let's say you put it in the market return, long-term expectation for the market, 7% sounds good. If you look at averages going back,
that's a pretty good
about 100 or so years.
I'd say 7% is a conservative long-term average for market, but
sure.
Yeah, that's a good number.
Yeah, so what that basically means is your 10,000 will double about every 10 years. So, after your first 10 years, your 10,000 goes to 20. Second, it goes to 40. So that's, 20 years later, 30 years later, you're talking 80,000. 40 years later, you're talking 160,000 by the time you retire. So that one small change you made in your life that you may not remember 40 years from now is something that could be pretty sizable. Now you keep making those different types of changes, and all of a sudden you're talking substantial amounts of benefit. And how much are you going to remember that fancy vacation to Hawaii versus that, that road trip to the mountains for the weekend? It's hard to say, but at the end of the day, these things can have a very long-term impact. So I think the people that choose the lean fire notion have some understanding that maybe these choices might be worth it.
Okay, so I I understand what you're saying. That opportunity cost is really important, and I think that makes sense. This actually reminds me of the book Happy Money by Dr. Elizabeth Dunn and Dr. Michael Norton, and other happiness research that I've looked into that does talk about the effects of kind of spending money and how those affect lifestyle. So one of their conclusions is that the car, and it's, I think it's a great, I'm happy you brought up that example. The car tends not to impact lifestyle. It does not impact your overall happiness. Well, happiness research is a conversation for the day, but car purchases and most material purchases tend not to impact lifestyle. But the vacation to Hawaii that you mentioned and most other experiences do matter. And I think that ends up being my issue with fire, especially the lean fire, is I agree with you about the car purchase. That if we can not spend money on depreciating assets, I'm in favor of that. I want to make sure the car is reliable. I'm a huge fan because of kind of reliable cars, because the stress of repairs and taking it to the mechanic, I think that part matters. And maintenance costs matter a little bit, but just that day-to-day, oh, my check engine light is on and all of a sudden I feel worse. That part matters. But I agree, not spending extra money on the car because of the opportunity cost. But the vacations and going to a restaurant doesn't have to be super expensive, but just that experience of going out to eat, especially with other people, whether it's a spouse or partner or friends or their family, I think those are kind of the important things in life that pursuing the lean fire, you tend to be opting out of those. And I don't know that that makes your lifestyle better.
Again, it's hard to say based upon the individual. I get what you're saying. And, you know, as you have said, also studies back this up. If you want happiness, focus on experience, not, you know, material possessions. And that makes sense, of course. But even with experience, you have the option to take an approach that may not cost as much. That's basically what it might come down to. It may not come down to the fact that, no, you can't take a vacation. It may come down to, well, let's consider a vacation that is not as costly. I think it is possible to have a lean fire approach, but still be able to enjoy life, be able to take as much, if not more, vacations. You just may have to put a little bit of limit on the actual outlay for those vacations. But it doesn't mean they can't be just as fruitful or just as exciting as a vacation that's more exotic.
Okay, so I agree with that. I think, and I think it gets back to your idea of the spectrum, that yes, there are vacations that are just probably cost too much. They are unnecessarily expensive. Same thing with cars, but I do like the idea of considering the future opportunity cost of the money spent on the vacation. I don't like the idea of restricting yourself unnecessarily. And so I guess when I think of fire, whenever someone's financially independent, I'm curious, what do they do then? I think that's my big thing. What do they do when they are financially independent? They've achieved fire.
Right.
What do they do then that they couldn't do while they were working?
It comes down to a few things. Basically, with FIRE, I really don't think it means you stop working completely. As I mentioned before, most Americans anyway are going to have to work past retirement age. Three-quarters plan to already. But even those that choose FIRE, I think they choose it for more options. Not the notion that they are going to quit all jobs, but the notion that now they get to choose what to do that's not entirely financially motivated. So, a large part of being able to become financially independent for almost anyone revolves around making choices that necessitate the requirement to focus on money. That's
Okay.
kind of how it works. If you want to retire, you got to put some focus on building up some capital. And usually that can involve choices that are not ideal. Now, when somebody's financially independent, things change a bit. It doesn't mean they don't have to work, but they can choose a line of work that's not always about the bottom line. And they can also choose to distribute their time more favorably. As we know, in this country, a few weeks of vacation or less is very common, and it's often encouraged not to take vacation. But, that doesn't have to be that way. If somebody's financially independent, like you said, they can have some FU money to basically say, that's probably not the way I want to live my life for the next 40, 50 years. Maybe I want to choose something that will allow me the freedom to say, I'm going to take a vacation for a year or two. I'm going to maybe explore some other options in my life that may not contribute to expanding my bottom line, but that's okay. Maybe it'll allow an individual to take more risks that they would have never considered possible, but may even lead to more financial remuneration than otherwise. A lot of the entrepreneurs that have been successful, that they did have some sort of backing that allowed them to take those types of risks. And maybe that's what a FIRE type philosophy may allow. So overall, maybe it leads to even more, economic growth for a society. But coming back to the individual, like you said, it's down to a spectrum, and everybody lies on this spectrum where you can have a savings rate of 0 and work till you're 99, or you can have a savings rate of very, very high and maybe have the ability to retire earlier, and anywhere along the spectrum. So it comes down to personal preference.
Okay, so I'm wondering if my issue with FIRE is the labeling and or the examples. Because I agree with every principle you said, that making sure you're saving enough is one of those things that is freeing. That knowing that you're on track to reach goals is what helps provide some of that confidence to do so. And it maybe doesn't require aggressive savings, but the idea that entrepreneurs have built up some kind of cushion before they take that risk, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I agree with that. So I'm trying to kind of wrap my mind around the idea that maybe the people who are pursuing FIRE don't like the company they work for, but if they found another similar role, or they figure out how to pursue entrepreneurship earlier, they would find that more fulfilling, even if they're not financially independent yet. So maybe the principle of saving aggressively early and minimizing expenses, it's not necessarily to be truly financially independent as early as possible, but it's focused on providing choices independent of money. Does that sound right?
I think I can agree with that. Again, we're talking about something that lies on a spectrum where for some people to have that assurance that they can make choices that aren't fully financially motivated, they'll need to step all the way up to the plate where they have enough passive income, for example, to cover all their expenses. Some people might say, if I just cover half, I'm okay with expanding my options and thinking more creatively about how I want to live my life. And some people might even say, I have a good plan at least, and that's good enough for me. I feel like this gives me the flexibility to expand my horizons a bit. So again, we're talking, I think, about something that could relate to personal preference.
Okay.
And maybe it also comes down to the analogy you put forward earlier about the car and the car that's used and it may have some trouble. Some people might say, no, I want to make sure that that car is new and I don't want to deal with it. And if it has any sort of issue, I'm just going to swap it out for a new one. And some people might say, well, I'm okay with taking the risk as long as I have a good plan in place to get it fixed or get a new one when I need to. I'll wait a bit longer. So, again, I think we're talking about something that might come down to personal preference.
Okay, so I think maybe it's like so many other things in life. If you when it comes to kind of either philosophy or dogmas or those personal preferences, it's almost easier to pursue it to the extreme and just follow these hard, strict rules than it is to apply nuance and find something in the middle ground. So I like the idea of managing expenses to keep expenses low. And I could see a solution for a couple who is considering pursuing FIRE is if they're managing their expenses low enough anyways, then they might be able to live off one of the couple's incomes while the other is pursuing the job or career that they find more fulfilling, and then maybe kind of switching off. And this is actually something that my wife and I, it wasn't intentional or wasn't a plan from the beginning, but we have kind of observed this. We are not financially independent now, but I had the confidence to start my own financial planning firm because she is working and is doing really well. And so that provides enough for our household for the time being. And in the past, she's had issues where when she was pregnant, we kind of decided she wanted to stay home with kids for 6 months when the babies were born. And that went beyond any maternity leave or disability leave. So we had to plan for this kind of unplanned time off, or it's unpaid time off. But because I was working, we could do that. So I think that ends up being my issue with FIRE is for anyone considering pursuing it, there are probably other options that would be just as fulfilling and will allow them to enjoy their lifestyle now without going hard down that path. And maybe it's the idea that spectrum that I tend to be against extremes. I tend to think that most things in life are in the gray area. They're in the middle somewhere, and that makes them more complex and nuanced. And your description of fat FIRE just sounds like working with a financial advisor. It's just like you just make sure you're saving enough and you'll be financially independent in your late 50s. Just like every client that I've worked with who has said, you're not saving enough, even though you're if you're making $200,000, you're maxing out your 401k, that's only like a 9% savings rate. So we need to bump up your savings to get it to that 12 to 15%. And they can afford it because they have enough income. And once you get to a 15% savings rate for retirement, especially if you start in your 30s, then they're on track to be financially independent in their late 50s. And so that never felt like a fat FIRE. It just felt like working with a professional that was giving you advice. So working on just making the right financial decisions.
I think that does play into it because you and I both know the status quo isn't that. The
Yes.
status quo is to spend as much as possible, to be heavily in debt, to work as long as you possibly can, and then dream about retirement, but still have to work well past that.
Yes, but I think that's probably that is a kind of socioeconomic issue in our country where there's a median household income of $50,000 to $60,000, but those that are pursuing FIRE have the resources to save so aggressively. They're trying to save $50,000 or $60,000 in a year, so they have the income. So once they're at that level, then achieving those savings rates should be very doable, very manageable. And sometimes they don't. Oh, my company matches 6%, so I put in 6% without realizing that's not enough. And as soon as they have someone point out, no, you need to save more, they can. And I think that ends up being more effective in terms of living a fulfilling life, both now and in the future, than pursuing that kind of lean FIRE movement.
Right. I think the way I see it is, humans like labels. We like to give things names. And it's good to give things names so then we can talk about it and see, say why it's good or bad, right? So I think, FIRE is a good name because it evokes what people want it to. Basically, the notion that if you save a ton, you can retire early. And, now that it has a name, we can talk about it. But going back to your point of a couple making the choice to retire early by saving a lot, I think a large part of FIRE is just understanding that you really can make those choices and they become easier, like you said, if you're earning 100, 200,000 a year in a given household. But as again, we also know that there's always that pressure to jump up your spending, to upsize your house, to add another car in, and so on. And FIRE is perhaps about resisting that pressure. It's the label we use to say, no, maybe there is an alternative to the status quo, the consumerism that we all face every day. So from that perspective, maybe it's just a label to highlight the alternative.
Okay. I can kind of get on board with that. I can, that idea of having the label allowing you to feel comfortable making those decisions, like you've given yourself the reason why you're making those decisions. I can see that, especially behaviorally, that being easier to follow. It's kind of why I like the example of clients who max out their 401k. They think, oh, I'm saving enough for retirement because I'm contributing the maximum, but it still is mostly the savings rate relative to their income. And if maxing out the 401k is a 15% savings rate, then yes, that's probably all you need, and you'll probably be fine. Then we can talk about, do you like your job, and have those kind of conversations. But if they're maxing out the 401k and it's only an 8 or 9% savings rate, and I tell them that's not enough, you need to save more, they weren't even aware of that. They just, oh, the 401k was my retirement account, I contributed the max, that means my retirement is taken care of. So I can kind of see the idea of that labeling with FIRE, where they're giving themselves permission to reject keeping up with the Joneses.
Right. And this all ties back to human nature as well. I'm sure you've heard this before. The average lottery winner, a few years after they win the lotto, is broke. You look at professional players in sports teams. You've probably heard of this on some of your sports podcasts. A few years after their very short career, they're broke. It's just human nature to, once you get a lot of money, to not really realize that that could be turned into a machine that prints you money forever. But instead to, realize that, okay, I have $1 million, I can spend $500,000 there, 300,000 there. And look, I have 200,000 in the bank to do whatever I want, not realizing you already paid half in taxes. So I think, human nature is to not really understand the implications of those types of decisions. I think that's why we do see the status quo of having late retirement ages and long working careers and little savings and high debt. And something tells me that seems to creep up on many people, even those that can save a lot more because of their high incomes. So I think from that perspective, it's just worth highlighting that there may be an option out there. But I also realize that a lot of people won't really care about the notion that they could be saving earlier. It's also human nature to extrapolate forward whatever's happening today, meaning, okay, we're earning 200,000 today. Well, let's just push that forward for the next 40 years and you never have to save a penny because of course there's a money machine that keeps walking through the door with a paycheck. But perhaps even if that was true, there's another way to go about it.
Okay, so I guess I would agree. If I had a client come in, I would rather they were saving 30% than 5%. So if those are kind of the two choices, yes, I would rather that you're saving super aggressively than not saving enough, because super aggressive savings gives you lots of options and choices and flexibility in the future, and not saving enough requires so many drastic changes that it might be too hard to implement. And if someone using the FIRE label as their personal justification for why they're saving that aggressively, then that's probably okay as well. And I'd say even if they're saving that much, that I could even see the idea that gives them enough leeway to make financial mistakes and choices that they don't have to work with an advisor, because they're saving so aggressively and keeping their expenses so low. If they're just invested in any random index fund, they're going to be fine. But I do think the reason I didn't like is that if those are your two choices, saving 5% or 30, yes, 30 is better. But for most people, their life would be better and more fulfilled if they're saving something on a scale of 15%. If they're finding that happy middle in the gray area where they get to enjoy their life now, but they aren't risking the future unnecessarily. They are saving enough for those future goals, but they still get to spend that extra 20%, whether it is vacations, dinner with friends and family, or the reliable car. But that 15% might be harder, and maybe that's why I know it's self-selection bias. The kind of the clients who are working with an advisor are saving 15%. It's the ones who aren't working with an advisor that are pursuing 30% or 5%. They're either doing it way too much or way too little. But because they don't have the technical financial planning skills to understand that middle ground and to follow that path.
I think in terms of that demographic, what you'll probably find, of course, I don't have a study at my fingertips to back this one up, but I'd say most people fall under, the less than 5% bucket. And, there's probably a healthy amount of people that do fall in, the 10, 15% bucket. But I think the more you save, probably the smaller amount of people that actually follow that. But
it's definitely not a normal distribution. It's definitely going to be skewed way left in terms of savings.
Right. I'd say it's probably, exponentially. Law of diminishing returns might, be more applicable here. So the higher your savings rate, the less amount of people would subscribe to that philosophy. But, what I'd say is for those that do, it's probably a demographic of people that anti-consumerism resonates strongly with them. Maybe this is the demographic of people that The notion of less is more makes sense. It's entirely possible that this demographic isn't as conducive to having a professional financial planner, as you suggest. But nevertheless, this demographic probably does exist. And it's hard to say that they're less happy. But, maybe these are the types of lifestyle choices that they're comfortable with.
Okay. I think I want to kind of wrap up there. And I think the next conversation would be, maybe we'll explore kind of why they feel that way. So I kind of agree. It's like, it would not surprise me if there is a demographic whose parents went to college and they were working professionals, so their kids went to college, and they have seen a lifestyle that a high income and a college education can provide. And there is also the demographic whose parents didn't go to college. They did not see kind of the same level of consumerism. They grew up with that scarcity mentality. And so when they get the high income from their education and pursuing the career, then they realize, well, I'm not used to anything else. I can live comfortably in the same way that I grew up and still use this extra income to be financially dependent. And so I wonder if there's a difference there.
That's certainly worth exploring. The third bucket that came to my mind is maybe there's a demographic where they did grow up with all the laugh of luxury, but they realized that maybe it was excessive.
Interesting. Okay. So I think we'll have to explore those issues at a later conversation. I'd also like to go into safe withdrawal rate research at a later conversation, kind of the happiness research we talked about, well-being, fulfillment, and how people make financial decisions is really interesting to me.
Yeah, I think those are all good topics. What we're talking about when we talk about investing is really how people behave. Mm-hmm. and how they react to different situations when it comes to money. And a lot of this underlies a branch of finance known as behavioral finance. And yeah. I'm sure there are many topics there that we can discuss as well. But the notion is that often we may not behave in ways that align with our intended best interests. And this comes up a lot in finance. So I think it's definitely an area we'll want to explore down the road.
I like that. Okay. So different topics of behavioral finance. I like that. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the conversation today, Trishul.
Well, thank you, Aaron. It's been great. And, of course, thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you, everyone. And we'll let you know when we have our next topic ready.
That sounds good. All right.
Bye.
Bye.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of the Mind Money Spectrum podcast. Be sure to visit mindmoneyspectrum.com to access the entire library of episodes. Remember, it's not black and white, but the wide spectrum of gray area where you get to pursue the freedoms you want in life. Opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and has no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested in directly. Have a nice day.